Hello, welcome to the Big Idea webinar, brought to you by Thinkers50 and Zevio. I'm Des Deal, co-founder of Thinkers50, the world's most reliable resource for identifying, ranking and sharing the leading management ideas of our age. Since 2001, we've been providing access to ideas with the power to make the world a better place. And that mission has never seemed so relevant or quite so pressing. At Thinkers50, we believe that new ideas and fresh thinking will enable us to innovate our way out of the COVID crisis, to reboot our economies and get back to work and back to growth. We want to inspire you to seize this moment to create a better future for you and for your organization. So in this webinar, our very special guest, Danish-born author and thought leader, Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg, will explain how reframing is the crucial underutilized skill you can master to transform your organization, career, and life. Thomas is a globally recognized expert on innovation and problem solving. His books include Innovation as Usual, which he co-authored with Paddy Miller, and most recently, What's Your Problem, which has the great subtitle of To Solve the Toughest Problems, Change the Problems You Solve. Thomas has shared and refined his reframing method with some of the leading organizations in the world, including Microsoft, the Wall Street Journal, and the United Nations. His research has been featured in the Harvard Business Review, on BBC Radio and the Financial Times. He holds an MA in Media Science from the University of Copenhagen and an MBA from ESA Business School. Prior to his business career, Thomas served for 4 years as an officer with the Danish Royal Guards. Thomas, welcome.
Well, thank you, Des. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in here today. Yeah, I'm very happy to be capable of spending a little bit of time. Des, are you highlighting a bit of the agenda, or? I
was just going to say, yeah, the format today is that we have 30 minutes. So Thomas will present for 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a little bit of time for a conversation, for a discussion. So Thomas, over to you. The virtual stage is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I'm going to share one big idea with you today, which is that there is a missing link in the way we approach problems. There's a missing skill that is absolutely crucial, and yet most people aren't very good at it. Today, I'm going to introduce you to it and give you a little bit of guidance on how to get better at it. And it's all linked to the notion that when we think about problem solving, we tend to think there's two components. That's what we learn in school, and that's what we practice in most of in our workplaces and so on. The components you can see behind me, namely, first you analyze the problem and then you solve it. That's great, but there is a higher level skill that is crucially important that most people don't master, and that is the notion of framing or reframing problems. And in academia, we call it problem finding. In practice, you can think of it as the art of making sure you solve the right problems. I'm going to start with sharing an example of this. And this is a very memorable way of understanding the difference between just analyzing a problem and then getting it framed correctly. And it's called the slow elevator problem. The slow elevator problem, in essence, is this: that you own an office building, and all your tenants in this building, well, they are complaining about the lift. It's old, it's slow, and they are actually threatening to break their leases if you don't fix this problem with the speed of the elevator. I am going to show you here a little bit in graphic form how people think about this. Because when you reflect on what's happening here in the slow elevator problem, that problem is not coming to you neutrally. Somebody has already framed it for you and said the problem is that the elevator is slow. And what most people do in that situation is to swing rapidly into action mode and try to figure out, how do we make the elevator faster? Do we upgrade the motor? Do we tweak the algorithm? Do we have to go out and buy a new elevator to make this work? But if you ask experienced landlords about this problem, they will sometimes suggest to you a solution that's very different, that doesn't make the elevator faster. And that is the notion of putting up mirrors in the hallway next to the elevator. Because what happens is, of course, that the tenants, they arrive, they're busy, and they go, oh, and then they look up, they see the mirror, and they go, oh, that's beautiful. And they forget time. The point is here, and the reason I share this example is that it illustrates a central idea of when it comes to problem solving, namely that sometimes in order to solve tough problems, you don't want to go into solution mode. Instead, you want to try to rethink the nature of the problem, to try to reframe it and see if there's a different or better problem to solve. The mirror, as I shared here as an example, it doesn't make the elevator faster. It solves a different problem, namely the problem of people perceiving the weight as annoying. The mirror, to be clear, this is not the answer to the slow elevator problem, because there are situations, of course, in which, let's say a core issue is that people are late for important meetings. Well, then a mirror is just going to be a distraction. The mirror is a memorable example of the core idea that sometimes in order to think differently about a difficult challenge you're facing, you actually need to step back to the problem and try not to analyze it, but to frame it differently. And you can see here how the dynamic I outlined here before it plays out. What most people do when they're faced with a problem, they jump straight into solution mode and they say, how do we make the elevator faster? People who are better at problem solving, well, they go in and they analyze the problem and they ask, why is the elevator slow? That's a good question, but that's not the best question to start with, because that risks trapping you in the first framing of the problem. What you want to ask before you start asking why and digging for root causes and all of that is the basic question, is this problem framed correctly? Is the speed of the elevator necessarily the right thing to focus on, or are there other issues or elements we can consider here? I'm going to share with you a case from the real world about this. I like to start with this one because both it clearly demonstrates what reframing is about. And this is an example you can share with others. Like if you're in a meeting, you're sitting with a client, you understand that they need to rethink their problem, so you can come in and solve it properly with them. Share the slow elevator problem. It is a very quick 1-minute way of making people understand the importance of framing problems correctly. I'm going to share with you now an example as mentioned. And that example comes from the world of shelter dogs. And this is a story I share in my book, which is probably one of the most powerful examples I encountered in my research around how our framing of problems affect and impact the real world. The shelter dog problem, in brief, is about the fact that we have a surplus of dogs and other pets in shelters. Every single year, we have lots of dogs entering shelters. Half of them get adopted. And in the years, at least prior to COVID, every single year, we needed to find new homes for more than a million extra dogs. And this is in the US. I want to introduce you to a woman called Lori Weiss. And Lori, she's the executive director of Downtown Dog Rescue, a rescue group that's involved in all of this. And she has managed to rethink this industry and this space in a way that we haven't seen in many decades by going in and challenging the understanding of the problem. The core fact that she zoomed in on was the fact that 30% of dogs that enter a shelter are so-called owner surrenders. What is an owner surrender? An owner surrender is when the dog hasn't run away or anything. It is when the family or the owners of the dog, they show up at the shelter and they hand over the dog themselves. Take our dog here. Well, knowing that the dog may not make it out of the shelter again. If you consider how this space, all of the people involved in trying to rescue dogs, think about those people. You might imagine that they're thinking some pretty bad things about them. These are people they hand over, it's like handing over a kid. Like they're willing to hand over their dogs to a shelter. These people should never have been allowed to have a dog in the first place. And if you, as an industry, think that the problem you're dealing with is the fact that there's a lot of bad owners out there, well, what do? You start creating screening processes. You start to think about how do we prevent bad owners from getting dogs so we don't run into this problem again and again. And that has very real world consequences. That what I'm showing you here is a sample form from an animal adoption shelter where this is the form you have to fill out if you are hoping to save a dog potentially from death. Why do you want a dog? Well, have you had dogs before? Have you had this type of dog before? How long will the dog be home alone during the day? What's the name of your spouse or roommate? What's the name of your employer? How about your landlord? We'd love to have the phone number of your landlord too, and some personal references and veterinary references as well. And is there fenced in yard? And here's the key question you don't want to answer yes to. Have you ever brought an animal to a shelter before? The industry, in its quest to save dogs, is creating barriers to adoption. What Laurie did differently here was to question the very premise that 30% of dog owners are bad people that should never have had a dog in the first place. What she did was to set up a small learning experiment to understand the problem better. Specifically, what she did was she had one of her employees in a shelter in LA. The employee would stand whenever a family came in and wanted to hand over their dog, and one of the owners surrenders. The employee would ask, if you could, would you like to keep your dog or your pet? First observation that they very quickly realized, 3 out of 4 families said yes, they did not want to get rid of their dog. They perceived it as their last option. And when the employee then asked, well, what's the problem? Like, why are you getting rid of your dog? It turned out that this was not really a people problem in the vast majority of cases. It was a financial problem. Fundamentally, many of these families had taken good care of their dog for years, but then they get evicted. And then they have to move into a new building. And in that new building, the landlord demands a $150 deposit for them to have the dog. If you know about the statistics in the US, more than 40% of families have trouble finding $400 for an emergency. There are many, many families for whom $150 is not something they can go get, especially if you've just gotten evicted. And so Laurie realized there's an opportunity here to solve a very different problem, namely to go in and help the dogs stay with their first family. They would go in and put down that deposit for the landlord or whatever other problem that the families were trying to face. And what Laurie realized through this and tracking the numbers was that this was not just on a human level a better solution. They allowed the families to keep their dogs. They kept the dogs out of the shelters so other dogs in need could benefit from that. It was also more cost effective. It used to cost Laurie's group around $85 per animal they helped. This new solution, the shelter intervention programs, brought that cost down to $60 per pet. The reason I share this example with you is because, first of all, it shows very clearly how our understanding of the problem and of other people's reality impacts our actions in both good and bad ways. If we get our problems wrong, we end up throwing up barriers to what we want to achieve. And if we end up thinking more carefully about the nature of the problem we're solving, if we end up trying to genuinely understand the people that are involved, then you can sometimes come up with radical breakthroughs, even in industries that have existed for a long, long time. Because when you think about it, Laurie's solution here had an interesting characteristic. It had nothing to do with technology. When we think of innovation, when we think of creative problem solving, we tend to think it involves something new, like a new technology, a fancy app that somebody in Silicon Valley built, and now we got the shelter problem fixed. But in reality, our solutions are already often with us. We have what's required to solve the problem. What is missing is to understand the nature of the problem fully and to rethink our own assumptions about what's going on. This is a problem in the shelter industry we could have solved 20, 30 years ago. Didn't require new technology. And yet it wasn't until Laurie and a couple of other pioneers started truly questioning the nature of the problem that we managed to find a new and better way of addressing this issue. And that's true, interestingly enough, for reframing as well. So I'm going to give you here a little bit of an overview of the solution I'm suggesting to this issue of us not understanding how to frame problems properly. When you think of reframing as a method, it's actually not new. This has been with us for more than 50 years. Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, Hungarian psychologist that some of you will know, was one of the first people who studied it empirically and found that it is a very, very powerful and impactful technique when it comes to solving problems. And yet, when you look at the situation today, well, how are we doing? I went out and surveyed more than 100 CEOs and C-suite characters. 85% of them came back and said, this is something in our company we struggle with. We're not very good at it. We tend to waste a lot of time, money, effort, basically trying to solve the wrong problems, whether internally or those of our customers. And more interestingly, I found that even people who are good at it, they don't know how or why. They may be capable of doing it themselves, but they are rarely capable of sitting down and telling somebody else how to get this right. So my work has really focused on it through this book that Des mentioned earlier. My work has focused on trying to develop a simple, easy to learn method for solving the right problems, for getting the art of framing our problems correctly right. It's something that I've dug into from lots of different disciplines, the research we have on it. And I've also spent a good deal of time basically road testing this method around the globe with lots of different companies that I've taught this method to. And I highlight that because I think one of the core problems academia is sometimes overlooking is that of creating the real bridge to practice. Academia is brilliant at coming up with new important ideas. We're not always as good at translating it into practice so we can use it on a regular Wednesday afternoon in a busy company in the midst of all the other things that are going on at the moment. A quick overview of what this is really about. And what I'm sharing with you here, you can try this yourselves on a problem you're dealing with right now. And I'll share a little bit of resources, free resources you can dig into as well. The core method is really a 3-step habit. That habit, if you think of problem solving as a straight line, the habit is almost a small loop on that line. What you do is whenever you have a problem, first you just describe it or frame it. You state the problem separate from the solution that you may have in mind. Then you gather 2-3 other people at least, and you try to rethink or reframe what the nature of the problem actually is. Before you go in and say, how do we make the elevator faster? You go in and have people help you rethink, is this really about the speed of the elevator, or is there something else that might be happening here? And then at the end of that process, all of this, what I'm describing here, might be as long as 10 minutes. The end of that process, you decide how to move forward, because the big danger here with anything, with requiring thinking, is that you get stuck in the thinking phase. That's paralysis by analysis. You want to avoid that. So this is a method that you go in and use repeatedly throughout the problem-solving journey. If you have a problem, you start Monday with reframing, then you swing into action, and then Friday you might revisit the problem and say, given what we did this week, do we need to rethink what's actually going on in our situation here? And I'll share one more layer with you before we jump into the conversation with this, namely how specifically you reframe. Because the first and the third element here is not that tricky. The magic, of course, happens in that conversation where you try to figure out how do we frame this differently. And the core finding I've realized when I worked with companies all over the world was we tell people to question, but not all questions are equally good at reframing or surfacing a new perspective on a problem. There, for instance, the method that many of you know, 5 whys, always ask why 5 times. That's actually not that helpful, I found in practice, because it makes you dig deeper into the first definition. Why is the elevator slow? So what I'm going to share with you here are 5 specific question strategies, if you will, that can be very powerful at surfacing new angles on a problem. And to be clear, this checklist, it's available for free on the book's website, howtoreframe.com, so you don't necessarily need to write this down now. A brief overview of these, and this is the last thing I'll share, just to give you a sense of what these strategies are before we go back to the conversation part. The first and foremost, and you sense this here, is to actually ask, what are we missing? When we're looking at a problem, instead of delving deeper, what is outside of the framing right now? Are there people or factors that we're not considering that we need to look at? It's important because people naturally delve deeper. What you need to do before you delve deeper is to try to almost break the frame, if you will, by asking, what are we not considering here? We are focused on the speed of the elevator. Is there something else going on that we also should be paying attention to? You want to go in and challenge the goals. What are we really trying to achieve here? People are amazing at questioning a problem they're facing sometimes, but they're pretty bad at times at asking, are we aimed in the right direction? Like, we have an idea of what we want to achieve, but is that necessarily the right idea? Or do we even fully understand our goals? Digging into what you're trying to achieve, what does success look like? Going in and examining bright spots. A bright spot is a positive exception. So if you had a boss that never listened to your feedback, well, except there was one day where not only did they listen, they actually acted on your feedback. What was different about that day? Are there any positive exceptions to the problem? Looking in the mirror, which is not about the elevator mirror, but about a more painful question at times, which is to ask, what is my part in creating the problem? We tend to think that problems are something other people forced upon us, and we are the innocent victims here. It's created by those idiots over here. In reality, very often, there's something about our own behavior that is contributing to the problem and why it arises. And finally, maybe one of the most simplest ones, but one of the ones we also tend to forget, which is the basic act of genuinely trying to take the other people's perspective. As you saw in the case with Laurie, it is so easy when we're looking at other people to assume that they're acting in bad faith. When somebody votes from the other candidate, they must be monsters. When your partner at home is being egotistical, you're just assuming, that's just a character trait. They're just like that. Instead of trying to look deeper and trying to go beyond that intuitive, easy answer and see if there's something else going on beneath the surface with other people. What is their reality really, really like? I think everybody at the present moment is aware of the need for us to get better at that. This is what I had to share with you for now. As mentioned, you can download this checklist and more on the book's website. Now I'm gonna jump out of the slides here. We'll go back to Des and me, and we have a few minutes here, a little bit longer, for a bit of conversation around this. So Des, thank you, and back to you.
Thomas, thank you. That was brilliant, brilliantly clear, and you know, I think a lot of people have got a lot out of it. But one of the things that fascinates me, I'm a big fan of framing and reframe. I think it makes a huge difference. Eric Schmidt from Google, in endorsing the book, called the ability to do it well and tackle the right problems a superpower, which I think it is. But it seems to me it's actually a very neglected. I think you said 85% of CEOs or companies actually aren't good at it. Why do you think it is that it's such a neglected art or science?
I think it's tied to a huge myth around problem diagnosis. And it's actually anchored in a citation that most people are familiar with. They think it's from Albert Einstein, it's not. Namely this one around, if you had an hour to solve a problem, spend the first 55 minutes thinking about the problem, and then the last 5 minutes solving it. That's actually a bad quote. Like the overarching idea, pay attention to the problem, is great. But what that quote is really suggesting is that you should spend the vast majority of your time in analysis mode. That's a recipe for disaster. Like, anybody who knows about lean startup, design thinking, and so on knows that's a bad idea. So what is the core problem? It is that we think problem diagnosis takes time. We think in order to diagnose a problem right, you need to go off to the mountains for 2 weeks and think deep thoughts, and that's just never going to happen for 90% plus of the problems we face. The art here is to develop the skill together with your team of being capable of doing this in the span of 5, 10, 15 minutes as a daily habit that you can use again on a Wednesday afternoon. I think that's probably the biggest misconception that's been holding us back, perhaps along with the need just to learn how to do it.
I mean, I want to get on to the practical stuff, because I mean, you mentioned the bridge between, I mean, Thinkers50 is very much, keen on getting ideas into impact, to really get them out there. But just before we do, I mean, Peter Drucker pointed out that there's nothing more dangerous than the right answer to the wrong problem. And it seems to me that a lot of this is really addressing that fundamental question. As you say, people are very quick to jump to reframing. This is one of the problems, not just with creative processes, but in general, is that people jump too quickly. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And I think that's why we need better habits around this. We need to develop that super simple practice of saying, wait a second, folks, what problem are we trying to solve? And then crucially, trying to get at least a couple of other people involved, because the truth is you can reframe a problem yourself, but we are often too close to our own problems. So one of the most effective shortcuts you can have is actually to bring a couple of other people with you into the room and say, hey, I think we have this problem, but what do you think? Like, when we have bad employee engagement numbers, is that really because of this, or might there be other ways of looking at what's going on? Really getting it down to a super simple practice.
I mean, I know from the book, and I like the book a lot, that you've got your reframing canvas. There's some great tools and techniques in there, but I mean, let's talk about the practical stuff. To optimize. I mean, what's the optimal number of people then in a reframing? Because if you have a room full of people, possibly that could be unhelpful. It could go on for a long time. I mean, what is optimal here, and how long are we talking about? And give us some guidelines.
I tend to consider what's practical, because sometimes all you can do is just to pull in 2 people. Now, I've also seen some of my clients reframe questions over Twitter. Like Cisco had an example where they put out a problem they're facing to their out on Twitter with their developer network and so on, to get quick input on whether their problem diagnosis was correct. So for me, it's not so much about the specific number and more about what's viable. And of course, if you have 50 people and no process, that can get messy. So the more people are involved, the more you need to think about how do we manage this so it doesn't devolve into a long, impossible discussion.
I mean, to some extent too, this what I like is the kind of the practical end of Clay Christensen talking about, jobs to be done. Ted Levitt, all those years ago, saying with marketing myopia, saying, people don't want a 6-inch drill bit, they want a 6-inch hole. You know what I'm saying. So exactly. and that understanding that it's the frame that matters, and the problem diagnosis rather than simply leaping into it. So, taking all of that together, what can we do to reframe this whole COVID crisis? I mean, have you got anything for us there? Is there anything that we can do to just ease our burden or to move forward?
I would actually say, I think part of the solution to the COVID crisis is to make ourselves better at problem solving in general. Because if there's one thing that's true, is that this giant problem, the COVID virus, has engendered a river of new problems, smaller problems, that everybody's dealing with right now. I believe that if we can make people 10% better at solving the right problems, we are going to create an enormous positive buffer of extra resources, extra time, and so on, more needed than ever now, that we can direct more towards what we're already doing, the great work of problem solving that people are doing out there right now as we're talking. So I think don't have the solution to COVID overall, but I think on a micro level, this is something very tangible we can do.
Okay, very good. Thomas, we're out of time, I'm afraid, but thank you. That was fascinating. If you want to get in touch with Thomas, his details are on the Thinkers50 website. To learn more about reframing, go to, you mentioned it, howtoreframe.com. The book is called What's Your Problem? It's published by Harvard Business School Publishing. On behalf of Thinkers50 and Xevio, thank you for tuning in. And please join us next time for more fresh thinking with the Big Ideas webinar. Goodbye. Thank you again, Thomas.
Thank you, Das.